I sat in the mahogany-paneled law office as my grandfather's will was read. When the lawyer handed me a $52 million check, my parents snatched it from my hands and burned it with my father's lighter, screaming about me being undeserving. I didn't fight them. I just smiled quietly while watching the flames consume what they believed was my massive inheritance. My mother called me ungrateful. My father called me worthless. But I knew something they didn't. What they just destroyed wasn't what they thought it was. The acrid smell of burning paper filled Thomas Mitchell's law office as my mother Margaret stomped on the smoldering remains of what she thought was my inheritance. My father Robert stood behind her, his face red with righteous anger, the silver lighter still clutched in his trembling hand. They had no idea they'd just destroyed a worthless piece of paper. But to understand why I was sitting there so calmly while my parents celebrated burning $52 million, you need to know about the family they thought they knew, and the desperate financial situation they'd been hiding for years. Growing up in our sprawling Tudor-style home in Cherry Hills Village, one of Denver's most affluent suburbs, I always believed my parents were successful. My father Robert worked in commercial real estate. My mother Margaret ran an interior design business. We had everything that screamed wealth: the luxury cars, the country club memberships, the expensive vacations to Aspen and Napa Valley. What I didn't realize until much later was that my parents were living a complete lie. My grandfather William had built his fortune the hard way. Starting with a single oil well in Oklahoma in 1962, he'd grown his company into one of the most respected independent oil operations in the Southwest. He valued hard work, integrity, and what he called earning your keep. While my parents were buying designer clothes and leasing luxury cars, Grandpa William still drove his 1998 Ford pickup and wore the same Timex watch he'd owned for 30 years. The disconnect between my parents' values and his had been growing for decades. They saw his money as their eventual inheritance, something they were entitled to simply by being related to him. Grandpa William saw it as a responsibility, something that had to be earned through character and service to others. I was the bridge between these two worlds. From the time I was 8 years old, I spent every summer working on Grandpa William's ranch outside Colorado Springs. While my parents were planning their next expensive vacation, I was learning to fix fences, tend cattle, and understand the value of honest labor. While they were attending charity galas to be seen by the right people, Grandpa William was teaching me that real charity meant helping people without expecting recognition. By the time I graduated from Colorado State University with a degree in business administration, I understood my grandfather's values in a way my parents never would. I'd worked part-time jobs throughout college, despite my parents' protests that it was beneath our family's station. I'd learned to budget, save money, and make careful financial decisions. Most importantly, I'd learned that money was a tool for building something meaningful, not just a way to impress other people. My parents, meanwhile, had been steadily sinking deeper into a financial hole they'd dug with their own hands. The commercial real estate market had been brutal for the past 5 years, and my father's income had dropped by more than 60%. My mother's interior design business had never been profitable, existing mainly to give her something impressive to talk about at social gatherings. But rather than adjusting their lifestyle, they'd simply borrowed more money to maintain their image. Credit card debt had mounted to over $400,000. They'd taken a second mortgage on their home. They'd borrowed against Robert's retirement accounts. They'd maxed out home equity lines of credit. Every month, they were falling further behind, but they kept up the facade of success because admitting failure would mean losing their social status in Denver's elite circles. I discovered the extent of their financial desperation by accident, 6 months before Grandpa William's death. I'd stopped by their house to drop off some business documents Robert had left in my car after a family dinner. He wasn't home, but my mother asked me to put the papers on his desk in his study. That's when I saw the stack of overdue bills, collection notices, and bankruptcy attorney advertisements scattered across his normally pristine workspace. The numbers were staggering. Minimum credit card payments of $8,000 per month, a second mortgage payment of $4,000, property taxes 3 months behind. Even their country club membership dues were in arrears. I realized they were probably months away from losing everything. But what shocked me more than their debt was the discovery that they'd been stealing from Grandpa William. Hidden under the collection notices, I found bank statements showing regular transfers from accounts bearing my grandfather's name. $20,000 here, $15,000 there, sometimes as much as $50,000 in a single month. The transactions went back over 2 years, and the total amount was staggering. They'd stolen more than $800,000 from the man who'd raised me to value honesty above everything else. That night, I drove to my grandfather's ranch in a state of emotional turmoil. I'd always respected my parents, despite their flaws, but stealing from family, especially from an 84-year-old man who trusted them completely, crossed a line I'd never imagined they would cross. Grandpa William took the news with the calm dignity I'd come to expect from him, but I could see the heartbreak in his eyes. His daughter, whom he'd supported through college, her wedding, and countless financial emergencies over the years, had been systematically robbing him while he trusted her with access to his accounts. What hurt him most wasn't the money itself, but the betrayal of the values he'd tried to instill in his family. He'd taught us that family meant loyalty, honesty, and looking out for each other. Instead, his daughter was exploiting his trust to fund a lifestyle she couldn't afford. That conversation changed everything. Grandpa William and I spent the next 6 months quietly planning for what would happen after his death. We knew my parents were counting on his inheritance to solve their financial problems. We also knew they'd learned nothing from their mistakes and would likely repeat the same destructive patterns if they received a large sum of money all at once. The will reading was the culmination of our careful planning. My parents had attended Grandpa William's funeral 3 days earlier, playing the role of grieving family members while secretly calculating how much money they'd inherit. They had no idea that their theft had been discovered, documented, and carefully planned for. When Thomas Mitchell announced that the bulk of the estate would go to me, I watched my parents' faces transform from smug anticipation to panic. They'd been counting on inheriting millions to pay off their debts and restore their financial security. Instead, they were looking at receiving a modest sum that wouldn't even cover their credit card balances. That's when desperation took over. When Thomas handed me what appeared to be a check for $52 million, my parents saw their last chance to control the family fortune. Robert snatched the check from my hands before I could even read it, while Margaret screamed that I was too young and irresponsible to handle such wealth. "You don't deserve this money," Margaret shouted, her voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "You're 28 years old and you've never had a real job. You've been living off your grandfather's generosity your entire life." Robert nodded vigorously, holding the check above his head like a trophy. "This money should go to people who understand responsibility, who've been supporting this family for decades. Clayton's never had to worry about mortgage payments or raising children or dealing with real-world pressures." Their words stung because they revealed how little they understood about my relationship with Grandpa William or the values he'd taught me. But I didn't argue with them. I just sat quietly and watched as Robert flicked his lighter and set fire to what they believed was my inheritance. As the flames consumed the paper, my parents' faces showed a mixture of triumph and desperation. They thought they'd just solved their financial crisis by preventing me from inheriting money they believed should be theirs. They had no idea they'd just burned a worthless decoy, and that the real inheritance was already safely beyond their reach. The silence in Thomas Mitchell's office was broken only by the sound of my mother's labored breathing and the crackle of the last burning edges of paper. My father, Robert, carefully ground the ashes under his Italian leather shoe, as if making sure no trace of the check remained. They both stood there looking victorious, waiting for me to break down or beg them to somehow undo what they'd just done. Instead, I remained perfectly calm in my leather chair, watching Thomas Mitchell's face with interest. The family's longtime attorney was observing everything with the careful attention of someone who'd been expecting exactly this scenario to unfold. "Well," Thomas said slowly, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "that was certainly dramatic." Margaret turned toward him sharply. "We did what we had to do, Thomas. Clayton is far too young and inexperienced to handle that kind of money responsibly. He'd probably blow it all on cars and vacations within a year." "Yeah," Robert added, his voice still shaky with adrenaline. "We're his parents. We know what's best for him. That money needs to stay in the family, with people who understand the value of hard work and responsibility." I almost laughed at the irony of my debt-ridden, thieving parents lecturing anyone about financial responsibility, but Thomas spoke before I could respond. "Actually," he said, opening a thick folder on his desk, "William anticipated that something like this might happen. He was quite specific about how I should handle various scenarios that could arise during the reading of his will. Margaret's face went pale. "What do you mean?" He anticipated this. Thomas pulled out a sealed letter from the folder, along with several other documents I recognized from my meetings with Grandpa William over the past months. William was many things, but naive wasn't one of them. He understood family dynamics quite well after 84 years of living. That's when I first spoke up since my parents had burned the check. "Tell them about our conversation 3 months ago, Thomas." The lawyer nodded solemnly. 3 months ago, William requested a private meeting with me. He was concerned about certain family members' financial situations and their potential reactions to his estate distribution. He specifically asked me to prepare for the possibility that there might be attempts to interfere with Clayton's inheritance. My mother sank into her chair, her face now completely white. "What kind of interference?" "The kind we just witnessed," Thomas replied calmly. William predicted that desperation might lead certain family members to take drastic action. He instructed me to prepare multiple documents for this reading, including decoy materials to test people's true intentions. Robert's voice was barely a whisper. "Decoy materials?" I couldn't help but smile as I watched the realization dawn on my parents' faces. "The check you just burned wasn't real, Dad. Grandpa William and I prepared it specifically for this situation." The room erupted in chaos. Margaret jumped to her feet, screaming, "That's impossible!" while Robert dove toward the ashes on the floor, as if he could somehow reassemble the burned paper. My Uncle Frank and Aunt Linda, who'd been quietly observing from chairs near the window, stared at the unfolding drama in complete shock. "This is some kind of sick joke," Margaret said, her voice rising to a near shriek. "You can't just fake inheritance documents. There are laws about this kind of thing." Thomas remained completely calm, his professional demeanor unshaken by the chaos around him. "Actually, Mrs. Patterson, everything we've done today is completely legal. The document your husband burned was clearly marked as a preliminary draft, not a final inheritance instrument. If you'd taken the time to read it before destroying it, you would have noticed the disclaimer at the bottom." I watched my parents' faces as the full implications of what had just happened began to sink in. They'd been so blinded by desperation and greed that they'd acted without thinking, without reading, without considering the consequences of their actions. But their shock was about to get much worse. "However," Thomas continued, "before we discuss the actual inheritance distribution, I believe Clayton has some information to share with the family." This was the moment I'd been dreading for months. Despite everything my parents had done, despite their theft and their lies and their destructive behavior, I still loved them. They were still my parents, and what I was about to reveal would shatter their world. "I know about the money you've been stealing from Grandpa William," I said quietly. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Margaret gasped and stumbled backward, catching herself against the edge of Thomas's desk. Robert's face went from white to gray, and I could see his hands beginning to shake. "I don't know what you're talking about," Margaret said, but her voice lacked any conviction. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder of photographs I'd taken of the bank statements in Robert's study. $837,000 over the past 2 years. Regular withdrawals from Grandpa William's personal account, his business account, and his investment accounts. 20,000 here, 50,000 there. Sometimes more when your credit card payments were due. Robert collapsed into his chair as if someone had cut the strings holding him up. "How did you find out?" "I saw the bank statements on your desk 6 months ago when I dropped off your business papers. At first, I thought there had to be some explanation. Maybe Grandpa William was helping you with a business investment. Or maybe there was some family financial arrangement I didn't know about." I paused, remembering the sick feeling in my stomach when I'd realized what those statements actually meant. But then I started paying attention. I noticed how you'd always volunteer to handle Grandpa William's banking when he needed help. How you'd insist on taking care of his financial paperwork because he was getting too old to manage it properly. How you always knew exactly when his Social Security and pension checks were deposited. Margaret was crying now, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of rage and frustration. "You have no idea what kind of pressure we've been under, Clayton. You've never had to worry about money a day in your life. You've never had to make mortgage payments or deal with business failures or try to maintain a family's reputation while everything falls apart around you. So you decided to steal from your own father? The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but I was tired of their excuses and their self-pity. Robert finally spoke up, his voice hollow and defeated. We were going to pay it back. Once the real estate market recovered, once Margaret's business took off, we were going to replace every penny. We never meant for it to be permanent. But it wasn't just about the money, was it? I continued, my anger building despite my efforts to stay calm. You convinced yourselves that you deserved it, that Grandpa William owed it to you because he'd been successful and you hadn't. You turned his generosity and trust into something you felt entitled to take. The silence that followed was broken only by Margaret's quiet sobbing. Uncle Frank and Aunt Linda sat in stunned silence, clearly struggling to process what they were hearing. These weren't just financial crimes we were discussing. This was the complete betrayal of everything our family had claimed to stand for. Thomas cleared his throat. Clayton, would you like me to explain what William discovered and how he chose to handle the situation? I nodded, grateful for his professional guidance in navigating this emotional minefield. Please. About 7 months ago, William's accountant noticed some irregularities in his financial statements. The timing and amounts of certain withdrawals didn't match William's usual spending patterns. When they investigated further, they discovered that someone with authorized access to his accounts was making unauthorized transfers. Margaret looked up sharply. We were authorized. He gave us access to help him with his banking. Thomas's voice remained steady and non-judgmental, but his words were devastating. You were authorized to help him pay bills and manage routine transactions. You were not authorized to transfer money to your personal accounts to cover your credit card payments and mortgage. The room fell silent again as the full legal implications of my parents' actions became clear. They hadn't just been borrowing money from family. They'd been committing fraud against an elderly relative who'd trusted them with access to his financial accounts. What did William decide to do with this information? Uncle Frank asked quietly. I answered before Thomas could respond. He decided to give them a chance to come clean and ask for help the right way. He waited for months, hoping they would confess and ask for assistance with their financial problems. He would have helped them, you know. He would have found a way to pay off their debts and help them rebuild their lives. But they never asked, Thomas added. Instead, they continued taking money, even increasing the amounts as their financial situation grew worse. I looked directly at my parents, hoping they could understand the magnitude of what they'd lost through their choices. Grandpa William spent his last months watching his daughter steal from him while pretending everything was normal between them. Do you have any idea how much that hurt him? How much it broke his heart to realize that his own family saw him as nothing more than a source of money? Margaret's crying had stopped, replaced by a kind of shocked silence that seemed to indicate she was finally beginning to understand the true cost of their actions. But Robert was still trying to justify their behavior. We were desperate, he said. You don't understand what it's like to watch everything you've worked for slip away. We were about to lose the house, lose everything. We would have been ruined socially, financially, professionally. We didn't have any choice. There's always a choice, Dad. You chose pride over honesty. You chose theft over asking for help. You chose to risk destroying Grandpa William's trust rather than admit you needed assistance. Thomas was organizing more papers on his desk, and I could see that we were just getting started with revelations that would shake my family to its core. The burned check had been just the beginning. What came next would force my parents to confront not just their financial crimes, but the complete destruction they'd nearly caused to everything Grandpa William had built over his lifetime. Thomas Mitchell opened another folder on his desk, this one significantly thicker than the previous ones. The documents inside looked official and intimidating, with multiple tabs and legal seals visible even from my chair several feet away. Before we discuss the actual inheritance distribution, Thomas said carefully, there are additional matters we need to address regarding Margaret and Robert's activities over the past 2 years. I felt my stomach tighten. I'd thought we'd covered everything when we discussed the $800,000 in stolen funds, but Thomas's expression suggested there were deeper problems I hadn't discovered. What kind of additional matters? Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. Thomas pulled out a stack of photocopied documents and spread them across his desk. Even from my position, I could see they were business contracts, bank forms, and what looked like loan applications. William's investigation into the unauthorized account access revealed more than just the cash withdrawals Clayton discovered. My father, Robert, had gone completely still, like a deer sensing a predator. "Thomas, I think we should discuss this privately with our attorney present." "Actually," Thomas replied, "William specifically requested that all family members be present for this discussion. He believed that transparency was essential for healing the damage that had been done." I leaned forward, trying to read the documents from across the desk. "What else did you find?" Thomas picked up one of the contracts and held it so I could see the signature line. Even from several feet away, I could clearly recognize my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. But something about it looked wrong. "This is a loan application for $200,000, submitted to First National Bank of Colorado 3 months ago. It's signed by William and lists his oil company assets as collateral." Margaret made a small, choking sound. Robert was staring at the floor, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "The problem," Thomas continued, "is that William never applied for this loan. In fact, he never even knew about it until his bank called to congratulate him on the approval." The room erupted in shocked voices. Uncle Frank demanded to know how such a thing was possible, while Aunt Linda started asking rapid-fire questions about bank security and identity verification. But I was focused on my parents, watching their faces as the full scope of their crimes was revealed. "You forged his signature," I said, my voice flat with disbelief. "You forged Grandpa William's signature on loan documents." Robert finally looked up, his face a mixture of shame and desperation. "We were going to pay it back before he ever found out. The loan was supposed to give us time to straighten out our finances and replace the money we'd taken from his accounts." Thomas shuffled through more papers. "Unfortunately, this wasn't the only forged document we discovered. There were also applications for business credit lines, lease agreements for equipment that was never delivered, and most seriously, an attempt to change the beneficiary information on several of William's investment accounts. I felt like I was going to be sick. They tried to steal his retirement accounts too." "The beneficiary change requests were never processed," Thomas explained. "William's financial advisor became suspicious when he received paperwork that didn't match William's previous instructions and typical communication style. He called William directly to verify the changes, which is how William first learned about the extent of the unauthorized activity." Margaret was shaking her head frantically. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. We had a plan to fix everything before anyone got hurt. We were going to use the loan money to pay off our debts and replace everything we'd taken from his accounts. Then we were going to tell him about our financial problems and ask for help the right way. But the plan fell apart when the first loan wasn't enough," Thomas said, consulting his notes. "According to the bank records, you spent the entire $200,000 on debt payments within 6 weeks. Your financial situation was so desperate that even that large sum barely made a dent in what you owed." I was struggling to process the magnitude of what my parents had done. They hadn't just stolen money from Grandpa William. They'd systematically attempted to defraud him using forged documents and false pretenses. They'd put his business reputation at risk, potentially exposed him to criminal liability, and violated every aspect of the trust he'd placed in them. "There's more," Thomas said quietly. I didn't think I could handle more, but I nodded for him to continue. "The forged loan applications and beneficiary changes weren't just submitted to one institution. William's investigation revealed similar fraudulent documents at 3 different banks, 2 investment firms, and a business lending company. The total amount of credit they were attempting to obtain using William's name and assets was over $1.2 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. My parents hadn't just made some desperate mistakes. They'd been running a systematic fraud operation using my grandfather's identity. If all of these loans and credit applications had been approved," Thomas continued, "William could have faced financial obligations exceeding $1.5 million. Worse, the complex web of cross-collateralized assets could have put his entire business empire at risk." Uncle Frank spoke up for the first time since the revelations began. "Are you telling us that Margaret and Robert's actions could have cost William his entire company?" Thomas nodded gravely. "The oil industry operates on complex financial instruments and leveraged assets. If William had suddenly been obligated for loans he didn't know about, secured by assets that were already committed to other obligations. It could have triggered a cascade of financial problems that might have destroyed everything he'd built over 60 years. I looked at my parents, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in my life. They weren't just people who'd made some bad financial decisions. They weren't just desperate parents trying to preserve their family's lifestyle. They were criminals who'd been willing to destroy an innocent man's life's work to solve their own problems. "The worst part," I said slowly, "is that Grandpa William would have helped you if you'd just asked honestly." Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "We knew he'd be disappointed in us. We knew he'd think we were failures. So instead you decided to make him a victim of identity theft and fraud?" My anger was building again, despite my efforts to stay calm. "You decided it was better to risk destroying everything he'd worked for rather than admit you needed help?" Robert finally spoke, his voice hoarse and defeated. "We thought we could fix it without anyone getting hurt. We thought we were smart enough to solve our problems without damaging the family." Thomas was organizing the documents into neat piles, each representing different aspects of my parents' criminal activity. William discovered all of this about 6 weeks before his death. He spent considerable time and money working with attorneys and financial advisors to unwind the damage and protect his assets from the fraudulent obligations. "He knew?" Margaret asked, her voice filled with horror. "He knew everything we'd done and he never confronted us?" I answered before Thomas could respond. "He knew, and it broke his heart. But he still loved you. He still wanted to find a way to help the family heal from what had happened." Thomas pulled out one more document, this one bearing Grandpa William's official letterhead and his distinctive handwriting. William left specific instructions about how to handle this situation. He wanted the truth to come out, but he also wanted to give everyone involved a chance for redemption. I knew what was coming next, because Grandpa William and I had spent hours discussing it during our secret meetings over the past months. This was the moment when his plan would be revealed, when his wisdom and love for his family would become clear despite everything that had been done to betray his trust. But I also knew that my parents were about to discover that their crimes had consequences far beyond anything they'd imagined. The inheritance they'd been counting on to save them was just the beginning of a story that would either destroy our family completely or transform us into something stronger than we'd ever been before. Thomas Mitchell lifted the handwritten letter from Grandpa William and placed it carefully on top of the other documents. I could see my grandfather's familiar script even from across the desk, the same careful handwriting I remembered from birthday cards and Christmas notes throughout my childhood. Before I read William's instructions, Thomas said, "I need to explain the actual inheritance distribution. What your parents destroyed was indeed a worthless decoy, but the real inheritance arrangement is more complex than anyone in this room realizes." He opened a new folder, this one containing official bank documents and legal certificates. 3 weeks before his death, William transferred $52 million in liquid assets into an irrevocable trust with Clayton as the primary beneficiary. Margaret gasped. 3 weeks ago? But he was supposedly too sick to handle business matters 3 weeks ago. We were told he was barely conscious. I couldn't help but smile at my mother's assumption. Grandpa William was alert and sharp right up until his final day. The only thing that was sick was his trust in certain family members. Thomas continued. The $52 million represents only the liquid portion of William's estate. The complete inheritance includes controlling shares in Patterson Oil and Gas, real estate holdings across 4 states, business partnerships in renewable energy projects, and the William Patterson Charitable Foundation assets. The total value exceeds $80 million. The silence in the room was absolute. My Uncle Frank's mouth was hanging open. Aunt Linda was gripping her chair arm so tightly her knuckles were white, and my parents looked like they'd been struck by lightning. "$80 million?" Robert whispered. "And Clayton already has access to all of it," Thomas confirmed. The trust was established and activated before William's death. Today's will reading was primarily ceremonial, designed to inform the family of decisions that had already been made and implemented. Margaret turned toward me with an expression of desperate hope. "Clayton, you have to understand. We never meant for things to go this far. We love you, and we know you'll do the right thing for the family." I felt a familiar mixture of love and disappointment as I looked at my mother. Even now, faced with the complete revelation of her crimes, Her first instinct was to try to manipulate me into sharing the inheritance she'd lost through her own actions. The right thing for the family, I repeated slowly. Let me ask you something, Mom. Do you think the right thing for the family was stealing $800,000 from Grandpa William? Do you think the right thing was forging his signature on loan documents? Do you think the right thing was putting his entire business empire at risk to cover your credit card payments? Thomas cleared his throat. Perhaps this would be a good time to read William's letter. He specifically requested that it be shared with everyone present. He unfolded the handwritten pages and began reading in his clear, professional voice. To my family, if you are hearing this letter, it means I am gone and you are learning about financial arrangements I made during my final months. I want you to understand that every decision I made was based on love for my family and my desire to see our values continue beyond my lifetime. The letter continued. I discovered Margaret and Robert's financial crimes 6 months before my death. My first instinct was anger and disappointment, but as time passed, I realized that anger would not heal our family or honor the legacy I wanted to leave. Instead, I chose to focus on how we could transform this crisis into an opportunity for growth and redemption. Margaret was crying again, but these tears seemed different. For the first time since the will reading began, she appeared to be experiencing genuine remorse, rather than just fear and frustration. Clayton proved himself to be the man I hoped he would become, Thomas continued reading. When he discovered his parents' theft, his first instinct was to protect me and seek justice, but he also showed compassion for the people who had betrayed us both. His character convinced me that he was ready for the responsibility of managing not just my wealth, but my values. The letter went on to explain Grandpa William's philosophy about wealth and family. He'd seen too many families destroyed by money, either through the lack of it or through fighting over it. His decision to structure the inheritance as he did wasn't meant to punish Margaret and Robert, but to create a framework for healing that would benefit everyone involved. Margaret and Robert, Thomas read, I know you believed you were entitled to my money because you are my family. But entitlement is not the same as earning. Love is not the same as trust. Being related to someone does not give you the right to steal from them, or lie to them, or put their life's work at risk for your own benefit. Robert was sobbing now, his body shaking with the weight of realizing how completely he'd disappointed the father-in-law who'd supported him for over 30 years. However, the letter continued, I also know that desperation can drive good people to make terrible choices. I believe that Margaret and Robert are fundamentally good people who lost their way when faced with financial pressure and social expectations they couldn't meet. Thomas paused and looked around the room. This next section contains William's specific instructions for how the inheritance should be managed. Clayton, he read, will receive full control of my financial assets and business interests, but with specific responsibilities. First, he must ensure that Margaret and Robert's immediate financial crisis is resolved. Their debts should be paid, and their home saved from foreclosure. Margaret's head snapped up in shock. He's going to help us? Thomas continued reading. However, this assistance comes with non-negotiable conditions. Margaret and Robert must acknowledge their crimes completely and honestly. They must enter financial counseling to address the underlying behaviors that led to their situation. And they must commit to earning redemption through service to others. Service to others? Robert asked. William established a comprehensive rehabilitation program, Thomas explained, setting down the letter and picking up another document. Margaret and Robert will work full-time for the Patterson Charitable Foundation for a minimum of 5 years. Their salaries will be modest, but sufficient to cover their basic living expenses. Any additional money they want to earn must come through demonstrated service to people in need. I watched my parents' faces as they processed this information. They were being offered salvation, but it required complete humility and a fundamental change in how they viewed their place in the world. There's more, Thomas said. The program includes mandatory counseling for Robert's gambling addiction, which William identified as a significant factor in their financial problems. It also requires them to make public acknowledgement of their crimes and their commitment to making amends. Margaret looked terrified. Public acknowledgement? You mean everyone will know what we did? Thomas nodded. William believed that real redemption required honesty, not just private regret. The family's reputation will survive your mistakes, but only if you're willing to take responsibility for them publicly and demonstrate your commitment to change. I could see my parents struggling with the choice they were facing. They could accept Grandpa William's offer of redemption, which would save them from bankruptcy and criminal prosecution but would require admitting their failures to the entire community. Or they could reject the offer and face the consequences of their actions alone. "What happens if we refuse?" Robert asked quietly. Thomas's voice became very serious. "Then Clayton will be under no obligation to help with your financial situation. You'll be responsible for your debts on your own, and the evidence of your crimes will be turned over to law enforcement for prosecution." The room fell completely silent as my parents contemplated their options. This was the moment Grandpa William had planned for, the moment when they would have to choose between their pride and their family's future. I knew what I hoped they would choose, but I also knew that the decision had to be entirely theirs. Grandpa William's plan only worked if they voluntarily chose redemption over self-destruction. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. My parents sat in their chairs, looking at each other with a mixture of fear, shame, and desperate hope. The weight of their decision was enormous. Accept humiliation and hard work in exchange for salvation, or maintain their pride and face complete destruction. Thomas opened yet another folder, this one containing what looked like legal pleadings and criminal complaints. "Before you make your decision," he said to my parents, "you should understand the full scope of the evidence that has been compiled regarding your activities." He spread out several documents that made my stomach turn. Bank fraud investigations, identity theft reports, forgery analysis from handwriting experts, and detailed financial forensics showing the systematic nature of their crimes. "The total amount of attempted fraud exceeds $1.7 million, Thomas explained. "The successful theft amounts to $837,000. Under Colorado law, these crimes constitute felony theft, elder abuse, identity theft, bank fraud, and conspiracy. The potential sentence ranges from 15 to 25 years in federal prison." Margaret made a strangled sound and covered her face with her hands. Robert just stared at the documents, as if they were written in a foreign language he couldn't comprehend. "However," Thomas continued, "William worked extensively with prosecutors over his final months to create an alternative to criminal prosecution. The district attorney has agreed to defer charges indefinitely if certain conditions are met." "What conditions?" Robert asked, his voice hoarse. Thomas pulled out an official document bearing the seal of the Colorado District Attorney's Office. "Complete restitution of all stolen funds, which Clayton's inheritance makes possible. Public acknowledgement of the crimes and a formal apology to the victims and the community, and successful completion of the rehabilitation program William designed." I watched my parents' faces as they realized that Grandpa William had been working to save them even as they were stealing from him. While they were forging his signature and lying to his face, he was negotiating with prosecutors to keep them out of prison. "There's something else you need to know," I said quietly. "The crimes you committed didn't just hurt Grandpa William financially. They nearly destroyed his business reputation and his charitable work." Thomas nodded and opened another folder containing correspondence from business partners and nonprofit organizations. When the forged loan applications were discovered, several of William's business partners became concerned about his judgment and financial stability. 2 major contracts worth over $10 million were put on hold, while partners investigated whether William was experiencing mental decline or financial difficulties. "Oh God," Margaret whispered. "We made people think he was senile." "It gets worse," I continued. "The Patterson Charitable Foundation was supporting educational programs for 300 low-income children. When the identity theft was discovered, the foundation's board considered suspending operations until they could determine whether William was still competent to manage the organization's finances." Robert looked like he was going to vomit. "We almost shut down his charity?" Thomas pulled out photographs of children in graduation caps and gowns. "These are some of the students who received scholarships from William's foundation last year. When the board considered suspending operations, these kids were told their funding might disappear just weeks before the start of the school year." I could see the full weight of their actions finally hitting my parents. They'd been so focused on their own financial problems that they'd never considered how their crimes might affect innocent people who depended on Grandpa William's generosity and business success. William spent his final months working 18-hour days to repair the damage you caused, Thomas continued. He had to provide additional financial guarantees to his business partners. He had to undergo psychological evaluation to prove his competency to Foundation board members. He had to personally call every major donor to the charity to assure them that their contributions were secure. Margaret was sobbing uncontrollably now. We killed him. Oh God. Clayton, we killed your grandfather. I felt my own emotions threatening to overwhelm me. No, Mom. You didn't kill him. But you stole the last months of his life. Instead of enjoying his retirement and spending time with family, he had to spend every day cleaning up the mess you created. Thomas set down the photographs and picked up another handwritten letter. William wrote a second letter, specifically for Margaret and Robert. Would you like me to read it? My parents nodded, though I'm not sure they really wanted to hear what Grandpa William had to say to them directly. Thomas unfolded the letter and began reading in the same steady, professional voice. Margaret and Robert, if you are hearing this letter, it means you have learned the full truth about your crimes and their consequences. I want you to know that despite everything you have done, I still love you both. Margaret's crying intensified, but she looked up at Thomas with desperate attention. I understand that financial pressure can drive people to make choices they never thought they would make, the letter continued. I understand that pride can prevent people from asking for help when they need it most. What I do not understand is how you could look me in the eye every week, share meals with me, accept my hugs and my expressions of love, all while systematically stealing from me and lying about your activities. The words hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be defended or explained away. However, Thomas continued reading, I also know that good people can do terrible things when they feel trapped and desperate. I believe that both of you are fundamentally good people who lost your way. The question now is whether you are willing to find your way back to the values we once shared as a family. Robert finally spoke, his voice barely audible. What does he want us to do? Thomas turned to the final page of the letter. He wants you to choose between two paths. The first path is pride. You can refuse to acknowledge your mistakes, reject the help being offered, and face the consequences of your actions alone. If you choose this path, you will likely spend many years in prison, your family will be destroyed, and the people you hurt will never receive justice or healing. And the second path? Margaret asked. The second path is humility. You can acknowledge what you have done, accept responsibility for the damage you have caused, and commit to spending the rest of your lives making amends through service to others. If you choose this path, you will avoid prison, your family will heal, and you will have the opportunity to transform your mistakes into something meaningful. Thomas set down the letter and looked directly at my parents. The choice is entirely yours, but you need to make it now, because the legal agreements and financial arrangements require immediate action. I knew this was the moment Grandpa William had been planning for since the day he discovered their theft. Everything he'd done over the past 6 months had been leading to this choice. Pride or humility, destruction or redemption, selfishness or service. My parents looked at each other across the law office, and I could see 30 years of marriage, shared dreams, and accumulated mistakes passing between them in that glance. They were facing the most important decision of their lives, and whatever they chose would determine not just their own future, but the future of our entire family. The silence in Thomas Mitchell's office had become almost unbearable. My parents sat there looking at each other, and I could practically see the internal battle raging behind their eyes. 30 years of pride, social status, and carefully constructed public image, warring against the stark reality of their situation and the love they still felt for family. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. If we choose the second path, if we accept William's offer, what exactly would that mean for our daily lives? Thomas opened another folder, this one containing detailed program descriptions and legal contracts. You would begin work with the Patterson Charitable Foundation immediately. Margaret, your background in interior design would be utilized helping families create safe, dignified living spaces in transitional housing. Robert, your real estate experience would help homeless families find and secure permanent housing. We'd be working with homeless people? Robert asked, and I could hear the resistance in his voice. You'd be working with families very much like yourselves. I interjected. Families who made financial mistakes, who lost their homes, who need help rebuilding their lives with dignity. The difference is that their mistakes were usually smaller than yours, and they had no wealthy relatives to steal from. Margaret flinched at my words, but she needed to understand the reality of what they'd be doing. The work isn't punishment, I continued. It's an opportunity to understand how your choices affected other people, and to use your skills to help rather than harm. Thomas spread out the contract documents. Your salaries would be $40,000 each per year, enough to cover basic living expenses in a modest apartment. Your debts would be paid off completely, but you wouldn't have access to credit cards or loans without program approval. All of your expenses would need to be approved by a financial counselor. $40,000? Margaret sounded horrified. That's less than we spend on clothes each year. Yes, I said simply. You'd be living like normal middle-class Americans instead of like wealthy people spending money you didn't have. Robert was studying the contracts with the careful attention he'd once applied to real estate deals. What about our friends, our social circles, our reputation in the community? Thomas pulled out another document. As part of accepting the program, you would be required to make a public statement acknowledging your crimes and expressing your commitment to making amends. This would be published in the Denver Post and distributed to relevant community organizations. The look of horror on my parents' faces was almost comical. They'd been willing to risk destroying an 84-year-old man's life's work, but the thought of their country club friends knowing about their mistakes was apparently unbearable. Everyone would know what we did? Margaret asked. Everyone would know that you made mistakes, took responsibility for them, and committed to making things right, I corrected. Or everyone would eventually know that you chose prison over accountability. Those are your only two options. Thomas leaned forward in his chair. I should also mention that William included provisions for your housing. If you accept the program, you'll move into a foundation-owned apartment complex where other program participants live. It's safe and clean, but it's not Cherry Hills Village. I watched my parents absorb this information. They were being offered a chance to avoid prison and rebuild their lives, but it required giving up everything they thought defined them: their social status, their expensive lifestyle, their ability to live above their means. What about our house? Robert asked. The house would be sold to help pay restitution, Thomas explained. However, any remaining equity after debt payments would be held in trust for you. If you successfully complete the 5-year program, you'd receive that money to help establish your new life. Margaret was shaking her head. 5 years of living like poor people, working with homeless families, being publicly humiliated. It's too much. It's not fair. I felt my anger rising again. What's not fair is an 84-year-old man spending his final months fixing problems you created instead of enjoying time with his family. What's not fair is 300 kids almost losing their college scholarships because you made people think Grandpa William was losing his mind. Clayton, Thomas said gently, perhaps you should explain the personal aspects of William's plan. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself before addressing my parents directly. Grandpa William wasn't just offering you a way to avoid prison. He was offering you a way back into our family. Margaret looked up sharply. What do you mean? I mean that if you choose the program and stick with it, you'll still be part of my life. Your future grandchildren will know who you are. You'll be invited to family gatherings and holidays. You'll have the chance to rebuild relationships based on honesty instead of lies. I paused, making sure they understood the alternative. But if you choose pride over accountability, if you refuse this offer and face the legal consequences on your own, then you're choosing to end our relationship permanently. I won't visit you in prison. I won't support you financially when you're released. You'll lose your son as well as everything else. The words were harder to say than I'd expected, but they needed to understand the complete scope of their choice. Grandpa William's plan wasn't just about money or legal consequences. It was about whether our family could heal from the damage they'd caused. You'd really cut us off? Robert asked, his voice filled with disbelief. I'd have no choice, I replied. If you can't take responsibility for what you've done, if you can't commit to changing the behaviors that led to this crisis, then you haven't learned anything from this experience. And if you haven't learned anything, then you're likely to repeat the same mistakes again. Thomas was organizing the documents into 2 neat piles. You need to make your decision now. If you choose the program, we can begin processing the paperwork today. If you refuse, I'm required to turn the criminal evidence over to law enforcement this afternoon. Margaret and Robert looked at each other one more time, and I could see something shifting in their expressions. The desperation was still there, but it was being joined by something else. Resignation, perhaps, or maybe the first glimmering of actual acceptance. If we do this, Margaret said slowly, if we accept the program and do everything that's required, will you forgive us? The question hit me harder than I'd expected. I'd been focused on justice and accountability and protecting Grandpa William's legacy, but I hadn't really considered what forgiveness would mean, or whether I was capable of it. I don't know, I answered honestly, but I'm willing to try. If you're willing to do the work to earn it. Robert was staring at the contract documents, as if they contained the terms of his surrender. 5 years, he said quietly. 5 years of working with people we used to donate money to. 5 years of living in an apartment and taking the bus to work and shopping at Target instead of Nordstrom. 5 years of rebuilding your character, I corrected. 5 years of learning what Grandpa William tried to teach all of us, that our value as human beings comes from what we give to the world, not what we take from it. Margaret reached across and took Robert's hand. We don't really have a choice, do we? You have a choice between 2 difficult paths, Thomas said gently. But yes, the easy path, the path that lets you avoid consequences while maintaining your pride, that path no longer exists. My parents sat there for another long moment, holding hands and staring at the contracts that would define the next 5 years of their lives. Then, slowly, Robert reached for a pen. Where do we sign? 1 year later, I stood in the conference room of the Patterson Charitable Foundation, looking out at the assembled crowd of families, volunteers, and community leaders gathered for our annual celebration dinner. The room buzzed with conversation and laughter, children running between tables while their parents shared stories of progress and hope. At a table near the front, I could see my mother Margaret speaking animatedly with Maria Santos, a single mother of 3 who'd recently graduated from our housing assistance program. Margaret was showing Maria photos on her phone, probably pictures of the transitional housing unit she'd helped design and furnish for another family last month. Her face glowed with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen since I was a child. Across the room, my father Robert was deep in conversation with David Chen, a military veteran who'd been living in his car when he first came to our program. Robert had spent 6 months helping David navigate the complex process of finding permanent housing, connecting him with job training resources, and rebuilding his credit. Now David had his own apartment and a steady job, and he'd become a volunteer mentor for other veterans in crisis. The transformation I was witnessing wasn't just in the people we were helping. It was in my parents themselves. The first few months of their program had been brutal. Margaret had struggled with living in a small 2-bedroom apartment after decades in a 6,000-square-foot house. She'd cried for weeks about having to shop at discount stores and take public transportation. Robert had been angry and resistant, treating his housing assistance work like a punishment he had to endure rather than a service he was providing. But gradually, something had shifted. Maybe it was the day Margaret met Jennifer Thompson, a divorced mother of 2 who reminded her of herself at that age. Jennifer had lost her home when her husband left her with massive credit card debt and no job skills. Margaret had spent hours helping Jennifer's family create a comfortable space in their transitional housing unit, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt like she was actually helping someone instead of just taking from them. Or maybe it was when Robert encountered Frank Williams, a former real estate developer who'd lost everything in the financial crisis and had been too proud to ask for help until he was sleeping in his car. Frank's story was so similar to Robert's own experience that it forced him to confront the reality that he wasn't fundamentally different from the people he was serving. He'd just been luckier in his choice of relatives. Whatever the catalyst, my parents had gradually stopped seeing their work as punishment and started seeing it as purpose. They discovered skills they didn't know they had and found satisfaction in achievements that couldn't be measured in dollars or social status. The public acknowledgement of their crimes had been as difficult as they'd feared. The Denver Post article about their theft and their commitment to making amends had been read by everyone in their former social circle. Some people had been supportive, sharing their own stories of financial mistakes and family crises. Others had been judgmental and cruel, whispering about how the mighty had fallen. But gradually, my parents had learned to care more about the opinion of the families they were helping than about the gossip from people who'd only valued them for their wealth and status in the first place. The most significant change had been in our family relationships. For the first time in my adult life, I genuinely enjoyed spending time with my parents. Instead of conversations dominated by complaints about money or boasting about expensive purchases, we talked about meaningful work, personal growth, and the difference they were making in other people's lives. Margaret had become passionate about interior design for social good, creating beautiful spaces on tiny budgets and teaching other families how to make their homes feel dignified and warm regardless of their income level. She'd developed a program that helped families transition from shelters to permanent housing, focusing on the psychological importance of having a space that felt like home rather than just temporary accommodation. Robert had discovered a talent for understanding the complex emotional and practical barriers that prevented people from accepting help. His own experience with pride and shame had given him unique insight into working with families who were struggling to admit they needed assistance. He'd become one of the Foundation's most effective case managers, with a waiting list of families specifically requesting to work with him. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in how my parents talked about Grandpa William. Instead of the resentment and entitlement that had characterized their relationship with him while he was alive, they now spoke about him with genuine respect and gratitude. They'd begun to understand that his plan for their redemption wasn't punishment. It was the greatest gift he could have given them. They'd learned that the values he'd tried to instill in our family weren't just old-fashioned morality lessons. They were practical wisdom about how to build a meaningful life. Hard work, honesty, service to others, and living within your means weren't restrictions on happiness. They were the foundation for genuine satisfaction and self-respect. As I watched my parents interacting with the families at the celebration dinner, I realized that Grandpa William's plan had accomplished something I'd never thought possible. It had made my parents truly happy for the first time in years. The financial counseling had taught them to find joy in simple pleasures, instead of constantly craving the next expensive acquisition. The work with homeless families had given them perspective about what constituted real problems versus mere inconveniences. The requirement to live modestly had freed them from the exhausting pressure of maintaining appearances they couldn't afford. Most importantly, they'd learned the difference between being valued for what you have and being valued for who you are. I'd also grown tremendously over the past year. Managing Grandpa William's business empire and charitable foundation had taught me lessons about leadership, responsibility, and the complexity of using wealth to create positive change. I'd learned that having money didn't automatically make you wise, and that the most important inheritance Grandpa William had left me wasn't the $80 million. It was the example of how to use resources to build something meaningful. Emma Rodriguez, the social worker I'd met through the Foundation's programs, had become not just my romantic partner but my closest advisor in developing new initiatives. Her background in community development had helped me understand how to expand our programs in ways that truly served families in crisis, rather than just making wealthy donors feel good about their charity. Together, we'd launched a financial literacy program that helped families avoid the kind of debt crisis that had destroyed my parents. We'd created a small business development initiative that helped people build sustainable income instead of just providing temporary assistance. We'd established scholarship programs that supported not just college education, but also trade skills and entrepreneurship training. Looking around the celebration dinner, I could see the impact of these programs in the faces of the families present. Children who'd been homeless a year ago were now talking excitedly about school projects and sports teams. Parents who'd been sleeping in cars were now sharing plans for their children's education and their own career development. But the most satisfying aspect of the evening was seeing my parents genuinely celebrate these achievements alongside the families they'd helped create them. As the formal program began, I stepped to the microphone to address the crowd. A year ago, I began, this foundation was supporting 300 families in our community. Tonight, we're celebrating our work with over 800 families, and we're just getting started. The applause was warm and enthusiastic, but I was focused on my parents' faces. They were beaming with pride, not because their son was wealthy or successful, but because they'd played a meaningful role in creating positive change for hundreds of families. The lesson my grandfather tried to teach our family, I continued, was that the true measure of wealth isn't what you accumulate, but what you accomplish. It's not about what you take from the world, but what you give back to it. I made eye contact with Margaret and Robert as I spoke the next words. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't money or material comfort. Sometimes the greatest gift is the opportunity to discover their own capacity for service and growth. After the formal program ended and families began heading home, my parents approached me with expressions of gratitude and love that I hadn't seen since childhood. "Thank you," Margaret said simply, "for giving us the chance to become the people we should have been all along." Robert nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Your grandfather was right about everything. We just couldn't see it when we were so focused on what we thought we needed instead of what we actually needed." As we walked out of the foundation building together, I realized that Grandpa William's plan had achieved something remarkable. It had turned a story of betrayal and financial crime into a story of redemption and family healing. The inheritance he'd left wasn't just money. It was the knowledge that love, combined with accountability, could transform even the most broken relationships into something stronger than they'd ever been before. My parents still had 4 more years in their program, but they were no longer counting down the time until their punishment ended. They'd found their calling in service to others, and they'd discovered that the values Grandpa William had tried to teach them weren't restrictions on their happiness. They were the key to finding genuine meaning and satisfaction. The greatest inheritance of all was the lesson that families can survive even the worst betrayals if they're willing to choose love over pride, service over selfishness, and growth over blame. Standing outside the foundation building with my parents, looking up at the Denver skyline under a canopy of stars, I felt Grandpa William's presence as strongly as if he were still with us. His plan had worked exactly as he'd hoped. Justice had been served, our family had healed, and his values would continue to guide our work for generations to come. The burned check that had started this entire journey had taught us all that the most valuable things in life can't be destroyed by fire or theft or betrayal. Character, love, and the opportunity for redemption are gifts that can only be lost if we choose to throw them away ourselves. So let me ask you, have you ever faced a situation where someone you loved betrayed your trust? How did you choose to respond? Did you seek revenge, or did you find a way to offer redemption? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and share it with someone who might benefit from hearing about the power of forgiveness and accountability. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about families overcoming their greatest challenges through love, wisdom, and the courage to change. Thank you for joining me on this journey. And remember, the greatest inheritance we can leave for future generations isn't money or property, but the example of how to choose love over pride, service over selfishness, and growth over blame.